He reluctantly said, "I do," not knowing he would end up falling in love with her. Caleb Hayes had always lived a simple life. He woke up before sunrise, worked hard all day, and rode his horse across wide, open land without worrying about anyone else. He liked it that way. No promises, no attachments, no one telling him what to do. For Caleb, freedom was everything. But that morning felt different. He stood outside a large wooden house, holding his hat tightly in his hands. The wind was calm, but his thoughts were not. He looked at the door in front of him and let out a slow breath. He didn't want to be there. Inside that house was the reason his life was about to change. A week ago, Caleb had learned the truth about his father's old debt. It was bigger than he expected, so big that he could lose the small piece of land his father had left him. That land was the only thing he truly owned. He had only one way to save it: marriage. Caleb shook his head slightly, still unable to believe it. Marriage was the last thing he ever wanted. He had seen too many people lose themselves in it, too many promises that turned into burdens. But this was not about love. This was a deal. He raised his hand and knocked on the door. A few seconds later, it opened. Clara Whitmore stood there. She was not what Caleb expected. He thought she would be quiet, soft-spoken, maybe even shy. But Clara stood straight, her eyes calm and confident. There was strength in her expression, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Mr. Hayes," she said politely. "Miss Whitmore," Caleb replied, nodding. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she stepped aside. "Please, come in." Caleb walked inside. The house was clean and warm, filled with sunlight coming through the windows. It felt peaceful, something he was not used to. Clara led him to a small table where her father was already sitting. Mr. Whitmore was a serious man, with a strong voice and sharp eyes. He looked at Caleb carefully, as if measuring him. "So," Mr. Whitmore said, "you understand the agreement?" Caleb nodded once. "Yes, sir." "This marriage will settle your father's debt. In return, you will stay here and help manage the ranch." "Yes, sir." "And my daughter," Mr. Whitmore continued, "will be your wife." Caleb glanced at Clara for a brief moment, then looked away. "Yes, sir." Everything sounded simple when it was said like that. Just words, just a deal. But something inside him felt heavy. Mr. Whitmore leaned back. "Good. Then we will not waste time. The wedding will be today." "Today?" Caleb asked, slightly surprised. Clara spoke calmly. "It is better this way." Caleb looked at her again. She didn't seem nervous. She didn't seem unsure. She looked ready. That made him feel even more uneasy. A few hours later, Caleb stood outside again, this time in front of a small church in town. The sun was high in the sky, and a few people had gathered. It was not a big wedding, no decorations, no music, just a simple ceremony, just like the deal. Caleb adjusted his shirt and looked down at his boots. He had faced storms, long rides, and hard days without fear. But this felt different. Inside the church, Clara stood quietly. She wore a simple dress, nothing fancy, but it suited her. She looked calm, just like before. When Caleb walked in, everyone turned to look at him. He felt out of place. He walked slowly to the front and stood beside Clara. For a brief second, their eyes met. There was no smile, no soft words, just understanding. The priest began the ceremony. His voice was steady, speaking about marriage, partnership, and trust. Caleb listened, but the words felt distant. He wasn't thinking about love. He was thinking about survival. Then came the moment. "Do you, Caleb Hayes, take Clara Whitmore as your wife?" Caleb hesitated, just for a second. His grip tightened slightly. This was it. One word would change everything. He looked straight ahead and said, "I do." His voice was low but clear. Then the priest turned to Clara. "Do you, Clara Whitmore, take Caleb Hayes as your husband?" Without hesitation, she said, "I do." Simple, certain, and just like that, it was done. They were married. As they stepped outside together, the sunlight felt brighter than before. People offered small smiles, but Caleb barely noticed. He stood there beside Clara, unsure of what to say. This woman was now his wife, a stranger, who was now part of his life. Clara finally spoke. "We should head back. There is work to do." Caleb nodded. "Yeah, work." That word felt safer, familiar. As they walked toward the ranch, Caleb kept a small distance between them. He told himself this would remain just what it was meant to be, a deal, nothing more. But as the wind moved gently across the open land, something began to shift, quietly, slowly, without him noticing. And this was only the beginning. Life on the Whitmore Ranch began early. Before the sun rose, Clara was already awake. She tied her hair back, put on her boots, and stepped outside to begin her work. The morning air was cool, and the land was quiet. A few minutes later, Caleb came out of the house. He noticed her near the barn, already busy. That surprised him. He had thought she would stay inside, maybe give orders while others worked. But Clara worked just like everyone else, sometimes even harder. Caleb didn't say anything. He simply walked past her and began his own work. That was how their days started, and how most of them stayed. They spoke only when needed. "Fence on the north side needs fixing. I'll handle it. Cattle need water. I already did it." Short, simple, no extra words. To Caleb, it was easier this way. He reminded himself again and again, this was not a real marriage. It was just a deal, nothing more. But Clara didn't treat it like that. She tried to talk to him. At breakfast, she would ask, "Did you sleep well?" Caleb would nod. "Yeah." At dinner, she would say, "You worked hard today." He would reply, "Just doing my job." Sometimes she would try to start a longer conversation, but Caleb always found a way to end it quickly. Not because he was rude, but because he didn't know how to let anyone get close. Days turned into a routine. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. Yet slowly, small things began to change. One morning, Caleb woke up earlier than usual. When he stepped into the kitchen, he saw a cup of coffee already sitting on the table. It was warm. He looked around, confused. Clara walked in a moment later. "I thought you might need it," she said simply. Caleb picked up the cup. "Thanks." That was all he said, but he noticed. Another day, while working near the fields, Caleb heard laughter. He looked up. Clara was talking to one of the ranch workers. She was smiling, her voice light and easy. The sound of her laughter carried across the open land. It was different. He had never seen her like that before. For a moment, he just stood there, watching. Then he shook his head and went back to work. He didn't understand why it mattered, but somehow it did. In town, things were not as quiet. People talked. They whispered when Caleb and Clara walked together. "That's the marriage, right? Doesn't look real to me. Strange pair." Caleb ignored it. He had learned long ago not to care about what others said. But one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A man in town made a careless comment. "Seems like you just married him to fix a problem," he said to Clara with a small laugh. Caleb heard it but didn't react. He expected Clara to ignore it too. Instead, she stepped forward. "That is none of your concern," she said firmly, "and you should show some respect." Her voice was calm but strong. The man quickly backed down. Caleb stood there, surprised. She didn't have to say anything. She could have stayed silent, but she didn't. On the way back to the ranch, Caleb finally spoke. You didn't need to do that. Clara looked at him. Yes, I did. People talk all the time. Let them, she said, but I won't stand there and listen when they speak without respect. Caleb didn't reply, but something inside him shifted again. No one had stood up for him like that in a long time. That night, the house felt a little less quiet. They sat at the same table for dinner. Still not many words, but the silence didn't feel as heavy. Later, as Caleb stepped outside, he looked over the land. The same land he had worked on before. But now it felt different. Not just a place to pass through, not just another stop. He leaned against the wooden fence and looked toward the house. A light was still on inside. Clara was probably still awake, finishing something. For a moment, he thought about going back in and saying something. Anything. But he didn't. Not yet. He wasn't ready. Because something new was growing inside him. Something unfamiliar. Something he didn't fully understand. And that made him uneasy. Because if this marriage ended one day, he didn't want to lose more than just the land. He didn't want to lose this feeling, even if he didn't know what to call it yet. And for the first time in years, Caleb Hayes was no longer completely sure of his own rules. Time passed quietly on the Whitmore ranch. Days turned into weeks, and weeks slowly turned into months. The work stayed the same, but something else began to change. Something neither Caleb nor Clara could fully explain. Their silence was no longer cold. It had become comfortable. Caleb still woke up early, but now he often found Clara already outside. Sometimes they worked side by side without saying a word. Other times, they shared small conversations. "Fence looks better today," Clara said one morning. Caleb nodded. "Yeah, should hold now." Simple words, but they meant more than before. One evening, after a long day, they sat on the wooden steps outside the house. The sky was painted in soft orange and pink colors as the sun began to set. Clara held a cup of tea. Caleb rested his arms on his knees. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Clara said quietly, "You don't talk much about your past." Caleb looked ahead. "Not much to say." "I don't believe that," she replied gently. Caleb was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, he said, "I moved around a lot. Never stayed in one place too long." "Why?" Clara asked. He thought for a second. "Easier that way." "Easier or safer?" she asked. Caleb glanced at her, slightly surprised. He didn't answer. But her question stayed with him. For the first time, he didn't feel like walking away from it. That night, something shifted. It was small, but real. After that, their days felt different. Caleb started noticing things he hadn't before. He noticed how Clara tied her hair quickly when she was busy, how she checked on every worker, making sure they were doing well, how she never complained, even when she was tired. And Clara noticed changes in Caleb too. He stayed longer at the table during meals. He asked simple questions like, "Did everything go all right today?" He even fixed things around the house without being asked. They were still not like a normal couple, but they were no longer strangers. One afternoon, Clara had to go to town to handle some work. Caleb stayed behind on the ranch. The day felt longer than usual, too quiet. Caleb worked, but something felt missing. He kept looking toward the road without realizing it. When Clara finally returned in the evening, Caleb was near the gate. "You're back," he said. Clara smiled lightly. "Yes." He nodded. "Good." That was all, but Clara noticed. He had been waiting. That evening they ate dinner together. For once, the conversation didn't feel forced. Clara talked about town. Caleb listened. Then he shared something small about the ranch. It felt natural. Later, as they cleaned up, their hands brushed for a brief second. Both of them paused, just for a moment. Neither said anything. But the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was something else, something new. That night, Caleb sat alone outside again, looking at the stars. He thought about everything, about the deal, about the land, about Clara. He realized something he had been trying to avoid. This was no longer just an agreement. He cared. More than he should. More than he planned. The idea of leaving this place, of leaving her, didn't feel right anymore. It felt wrong. Inside the house, Clara sat near the window. She was thinking too, about Caleb, about the quiet changes she had seen in him. She had always known this marriage was not built on love, but somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing it as just a deal. And that scared her. Because feelings made things complicated, and complicated things didn't always last. The next day, something unexpected happened. Caleb was walking past the back of the house when he heard Clara talking to someone. "I understand," she said softly, "but this marriage, it was necessary. That's all." Caleb stopped. He didn't mean to listen, but the words reached him clearly. Just necessary. Nothing more. His chest felt tight. He stepped back quietly before she could see him. For the rest of the day, he stayed distant. Short answers, no eye contact. Clara noticed immediately. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," Caleb replied, but his voice was colder than before. Clara frowned slightly, confused. She didn't understand what had changed, but something had. That night the silence returned, but this time it wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, full of questions, full of things left unsaid. Caleb stood outside again, looking into the dark. He had finally accepted his feelings, but now he wasn't sure if they meant anything. Because maybe, to Clara, it was still just a deal, and nothing more. The quiet distance between Caleb and Clara did not go away. Days passed, but things did not return to how they were before. They still worked on the ranch, still shared the same house, but something important had changed. The warmth between them was gone. Now, everything felt careful. Caleb kept his words short again. He avoided long conversations. He spent more time outside, even after the work was done. Clara noticed everything. She noticed how he stopped waiting for her at the gate, how he left the table early during meals, how he didn't look at her the same way anymore. At first, she thought he was just tired. Then she thought maybe she had done something wrong, but she didn't know what. One evening, she finally decided she couldn't ignore it anymore. Caleb was standing near the fence, looking out at the land. The sun was setting, and the sky was slowly turning dark. Clara walked toward him. "Caleb," she called softly. He turned slightly. "Yeah?" She stopped a few steps away. "Something is not right." He looked away again. "Everything's fine." "No," she said gently but firmly. "It's not." There was a pause. The wind moved quietly through the open land. Then Clara spoke again. "You've changed. You don't talk to me anymore. Did I do something?" Caleb stayed silent. He didn't want to say it, but he knew he couldn't keep it inside forever. After a moment, he let out a slow breath. "I heard you," he said. Clara frowned slightly. "Heard me?" "In the back of the house," he continued. "You said this marriage was just necessary." Clara's eyes widened a little as she understood. "Oh," she whispered. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah." There was no anger in his voice, just something quiet, something heavy. "I guess I just needed to remind myself," he added, "that this was never meant to be anything more." Clara took a step closer. "Caleb, I didn't mean it like that." He shook his head lightly. "It's fine. It's the truth, isn't it?" "No," she said quickly. "It's not that simple." Caleb finally looked at her. For the first time in days, their eyes met fully. "Then what is it?" he asked. Clara hesitated. She had always been strong, always sure of her words. But now, this felt different. Because this time, It wasn't just about the deal. It was about her heart. "I said that because I was afraid," she admitted softly. Caleb's expression changed slightly. "Afraid?" "Yes," she said. "Afraid of wanting something that might not last." Caleb didn't speak. Clara continued, her voice calm but honest. "When we got married, I told myself it was just an agreement. It was easier that way. No expectations, no disappointment." She looked down for a moment, then back at him. But things changed. The words hung in the air. Caleb felt his chest tighten again, but this time it was different. "How?" he asked quietly. Clara gave a small, uncertain smile. "You changed," she said. "You stayed. You worked hard. You cared, even when you didn't say it." Caleb said nothing, but he listened. "And somewhere along the way," she continued, "this stopped feeling like a deal to me." There was a long silence, but it was not heavy anymore. It was honest. Caleb took a step closer. "I didn't plan for this either," he said. "I never wanted this kind of life." Clara nodded slightly. "I know. But now," he paused, searching for the right words, "I don't want to leave." Clara looked at him, her eyes soft. "Not because of the land," he added, "because of you." Those words were simple, but they carried everything he had been holding inside. Clara's eyes filled with quiet emotion. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she said softly, "I was hoping you would say that." Caleb let out a small breath, almost like a quiet laugh. "I should have said it sooner." "Maybe," Clara replied, "but we're here now." The distance between them disappeared, not suddenly, but naturally, like it had never belonged there. The next morning felt different. The sun rose over the ranch just like always. The work was still waiting. The land was the same, but something had changed. Caleb walked into the kitchen and saw Clara already there. She looked up. "Morning." "Morning," he replied. This time he didn't rush outside. He stayed. They sat together, sharing breakfast, talking, not much, but enough. And it felt right. Later that day, as they worked side by side, Caleb glanced at her. No hesitation, no distance, just quiet certainty. The deal that brought them together no longer mattered, because now they were not staying out of obligation. They were staying by choice. And when Caleb looked at Clara, he finally understood something he had never believed in before. Sometimes, the things we don't choose at first turn out to be the ones we never want to lose. And this time, when it came to her, he didn't hesitate at all.